let us learn about types of friction. Okay. So how many types of friction will be there? Generally, three types of friction. Here three types given, but actually two types only. How many types of friction will be there? Two types of friction only. And what those two frictions are, Nana? First one is static friction, and second one is
Sliding.
1 minute. No, only 1 minute. Okay, how many types of friction? Two types of friction will be there. And what those two types of friction? So first type of friction is called static friction as it is there on the slide. And second type of a friction is called kinetic friction. What that friction will be called? Kinetic friction. So static and kinetic friction, two types of friction will be there. And how to understand them? And again, you have to understand one more point, that is nothing but in kinetic friction, again two types of frictions will be there, Nana, and those two types of frictions are, first type of friction is called sliding friction and second type of friction is called rolling friction. So totally how many will be there? Three types will be there: static friction, sliding friction, rolling friction. But sliding and rolling friction comes under what? Kinetic friction. And we have to understand what these frictions are. And after understanding them, you have to understand about static friction, you have to understand about sliding friction, you have to understand about rolling friction. And after understanding, you can say which frictional force is less than which frictional force. And to reduce friction, what we have to do. So that also you can say after learning about this. Is it clear, all of you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Tell me, Naisha, how many types of friction will be there generally if I ask?
Sir, three: static, rolling and sliding, and sliding and rolling come under kinetic.
So you have to say two only, Nana. First you have to say only two, that is static and kinetic. But in kinetic, again, how many types of friction will be there? Two types, sliding and rolling. So in general, when we are saying, you have to say three: static, sliding and rolling. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now let us try to understand first about what, Nana? Static friction. So suppose one surface is there like this, and on the surface I kept one object, and this object is there, this object is having a mass of 10 kg. How much mass is there? 10 kg mass is there. And suppose I applied a little bit of force in this direction, and that force I am writing it as a F. And in between this particular object and this surface, frictional force will be there or not? All of you. Frictional force will be there or not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Frictional force will be there in which direction? Whether in the direction of force or up, which is opposite to the force.
The opposite to the force.
Opposite to the force.
Arya?
Sir, I think opposite.
Kirtana? Kirtana?
Yes, sir.
Whether opposite or in the same direction this frictional force will act.
Opposite direction.
Okay. So we know that always the frictional force will act in opposite direction to the motion of an object. If we apply force in this direction, definitely object will move in this direction only, and frictional force will apply in opposite direction like this. Now suppose, now this whatever force I applied, this force is there, this force I applied with 1 Newton first, and when I applied 1 Newton of force here, this object not moved. and I applied 1.5 Newton. Still object is not moving. So when object is not moving, definitely in between this object and surface, here whatever surface is there, object is there, in between this surface and object, some frictional force will act or not? Ronak?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And this frictional force, whatever is there, will be called static friction. That means the frictional force acting it between two surfaces when an object is rest over other surface. Understood? Everyone?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, what I did is, now I increased this force to 2 Newton, 3 Newton. Like this, I increased applied force. But at 5 newtons, let us say this object is ready to move. It is not yet started, but it is ready to move. Then what we can understand? The maximum frictional force which can be there in between this particular surface and object will be 5 Newton. Okay, this 5 Newton. And if I apply more than this 5 Newton of force, tell me what happens generally? Have you understood, everyone? Here, first I started with applying 1 Newton. And after that I applied 1.5 Newton, I applied 2 Newton, I applied 3 Newton, 4 Newtons, 5 Newton. Up to 5 Newtons, this object not moved. So when object not moved up to 5 Newton, and when I applied 5 Newton of force, it is ready to move, but it is not moving. So up to this one is called static friction or not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Kavya, tell me again, what do you mean by static friction?
Static friction is when there is a frictional force acting on an object which does not move. Which is,
Okay. So when an object is not moving over the other surface, then whatever the frictional force will be there in between these two surfaces, that will be called static friction. And actually, this static friction is called self-adjusting force. What it will be called? Self-adjusting force. And how you can understand this one? So let me give one example. Now suppose you take your hand, and when you are taking your hand, first you keep one small scale, and if you put a small scale on your hand, some weight of that particular scale will act downwards or not? Ronak?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you hold it up without falling down?
No, sir.
If you keep that particular scale on your hand, it will fall. It will fall down, or it will be there in your hands only.
we can balance it on the dishes.
You can balance it. You can balance it, no?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, instead of scale, I kept one small ball and a rubber ball. Whether you can adjust the force or you can't adjust the force, whether the ball will drop from your hand or you can hold it. Ronak,
But we can balance it.
you can balance it. Suppose I replaced that ball with one more particular object which is having more weight than ball. Suppose let us say I took a big book. Big book is there, Nana, and I kept that on your hand. Can you adjust that particular book on your hand or not? Ronak.
Sir, we can adjust, but as it is heavy, it can fall down.
Right. So when you are go on increasing the weight on your hand, you can self adjust the force in such a way that you can balance it, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now suppose I kept one school bag which is loaded heavily on your hand. Can you hold it now?
Sir, no.
So,
No. Kavya, can you hold it?
unless you have superhuman powers, no, you can't.
So unless you are having superpower, you can't hold it. That means your hand is having some limit or not.
It
Yes, sir.
has.
Okay, so your hand is having some limit which can bear the weight. Similarly, here also this static friction also can bear up to certain limit only. So first I started with 1 Newton, second 1.5 Newton, and after that 2 Newton. So it is self-adjusting. Even though you are applying force up to 5 Newton, it is self-adjusting the frictional force, and after that what happens is the balancing will miss. What will miss? Balancing will miss. That means the force which you applied and the frictional force which is there in between that object and surface will not balance after this 5 Newton. Suppose if you apply 5.1 Newton, then what happens? Unbalanced force will be there between those two surfaces, and because of that the object starts moving. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. When an object is moving, when an object is moving, suppose let us say it is moving like this, and when it is moving like this, whatever the frictional force will be there between this particular surface and object will be called kinetic friction. So when an object is moving, when whatever the frictional force will be there between object and surface, that particular friction will be called kinetic friction. And when object is there at a rest on this particular surface, then that particular friction will be called static friction. So two types of friction will be there. When object is moving, that is called kinetic friction. When object is there at a rest, that friction will be called static friction. Is it clear for all of you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now tell me, static friction is a self-adjusting force or not?
Yes, sir, it is.
Kavya, Kirtana, Naisha,
I think
Kavya,
it is.
I think
Naisha.
it is a self-adjusting.
Self-adjusting force means what? What you understood regarding to that?
So may I?
Others except Ronak. Naisha,
Yes, sir.
tell me fast. What you understood related to self-adjusting force?
Um, like if uh
Okay. Kavya, Kirtana, Ronak.
Yes, sir. So
Tell me.
self-adjusting. Yes, sir. So self-adjusting force means the friction. Sorry, sir. Yes, so static friction can hold up to a limit. After that, if the forces are unbalanced, then the object will move till the time it will
Very
move.
good. So that means if you go on increasing the force between, sorry, force on any object which is there on other surface, what happens is the object will not move. That means up to that limit, the frictional force will balance the applied force. So that means it is self-adjusting itself, and the maximum limit which it can be there will be called limiting friction. This 5 Newton, now whatever example I gave, this 5 Newton will be called which friction? Limiting friction. So limiting friction means maximum static friction or minimum static friction?
So maximum.
Very good. Maximum static friction will be called limiting friction. Before that limiting friction, whatever is there will be called what?
Static friction.
Static friction. And after limiting friction, what happens? Kavya.
After that, it starts moving because the force gets over the limitation of.
Very good. Naisha.
Sir, may I?
Naisha. I will
Yeah,
give you
could
a
you
chance.
repeat, sir? I couldn't hear you.
Huh?
Could you repeat your question? I couldn't hear you.
After limiting friction, what happens?
Eventually, the body starts to move.
Very good. Arya.
Sir, may I?
One
Sir,
minute.
I will give a nine.
Arya.
Yes, sir.
Tell me what happens after limiting friction.
Um, Sir, I'm not sure.
Even though you are not sure, you have to give answer, Nana. Whether it is right or wrong. In previous class also I said, if it is right or wrong, you have to give answer. At least try. Arya. After limiting friction, what happens to the object?
Sir, can I tell?
Tell. Ronak.
Yes, sir. Sir, after that, the object starts to move and kinetic friction is produced.
Very good. After limiting friction, the object starts moving, and when an object is moving over the other surface, then whatever the friction will be there, that friction will be called kinetic friction. So this kinetic friction again divided into two groups, and those two are what? Sliding and rolling friction. Tell me, Arya.
Sir, I just told. Okay, sir.
Again.
Sir, I just told you. Okay, sir. I didn't say anything or ask anything.
Okay. Next. So generally, tell me how many types of friction will be there up to whatever you studied. You tell me. Ronak.
So generally two:
What those are?
static friction and kinetic friction.
So kinetic frictions are how many types?
So two: sliding friction and rolling friction.
Very good. So generally to say three types of friction will be there: static, sliding and rolling. What they are and how to understand them, so that we are going to learn in the next slide.